Oh, yes. I'll put mine here.
It's the best.
If you could, it's not on, I don't think. If you could start taking your seats. Is this on?
That's on. Is there a switch?
Yeah. Sit.
Check, check, check.
Hello? Good afternoon. Is that okay? If you could take your seats, we'd like to get started. Can you hear me back there? Can you hear me? How about is yours work? None of them are working. Good afternoon. Hello? Okay. Testing, 1, 2, 3, 4. mayor can hear, but not the people in the room. Is that it? Your mic's on? Okay, I can hear yours. Okay. Good afternoon and welcome to the Endowed Chairs Colloquia. I'd first of all like to thank the Endowed Chairs, particularly Marilyn and Henry, for organizing this series. This provides us with a tremendous opportunity to hear from scholars within our school regarding the critically important educational policy issues that shape our work, teaching, and the lives of children and educators every day. It brings us together as a community to discuss these issues in an informed way. A discussion on the Common Core is a great starting place for the series. While the Common Core is in the process of being rolled out across the nation, heated debate continues on the wisdom of this initiative and its assessments from varied constituencies. Indeed, a number of states that were on board with the Common Core are reversing their position. The landscape is complicated and much misinformation exists, according to a report by the Center on Educational Policy at George Washington University, which argues for the importance of more research-based information. As the debate continues, Lynch School faculty who instruct our students in educational pedagogy and assessment are preparing them in alignment with the Common Core, as is the Lynch School research in science and math education and other areas. I welcome Henry, Marilyn, and Mike here today to advance this discussion at the Lynch School and across the broader education and policy communities. Today, our event is being live streamed, a practice that we hope to continue so that our alumni, colleagues, and those beyond our university who cannot be here today will be able to follow the discussion. Thank you very much. And we're happy to see a large audience present in the room today. Here we have the agenda for the Endowed Chairs Colloquium series across the year. You can see there are two more events on December 9th and January 27th that have already been scheduled. At the same time, I'd like to remind you all to attend our Lynch School Symposium on October 21st at 4:30 with Joan Lombardi, who will talk on early childhood development, looking back and looking forward. We also have the C-Steep Colloquium series, and there will be another event next Tuesday. Did you want to say a word about that, Henry, on the topic for?
I wish I would.
Okay. How about you, Andy?
I'm okay.
You're okay. So anyway, it will continue, and we will start first on our discussion now on the Common Core standards and assessments. Where are we with Marilyn, Henry, and Mike? Thank you.
I'd like to add my welcome to Maureen's, and on behalf of the Endowed Chairs and Henry and I, who have been organizing this now for 8 years. I checked. We're really glad to see so many people, and especially a lot of students here. So this is the way we're going to work this morning. Each of the three of us is going to do sort of a different take on the Common Core. We're each going to speak for a relatively short amount of time. We hope there will be discussion. I'm going to focus on the arguments behind the Common Core, and Maureen just mentioned there are a lot of arguments in both senses of the word. So I'm going to try to unpack some of the controversies. Henry is going to focus on assessment as part of the Common Core in relation to assessment. He's going to talk about that as part of the academic core of schooling, and he's especially going to be interested in issues of trade-offs. And then finally, Mike is going to talk about the lasting impacts of the Common Core on educational testing, especially in terms of technology, accessibility, and practice. So for my part, we thought that we would need a little basic information about the Common Core first, in case some of you are less familiar with it than others, and especially perhaps for international students and others who are in the audience. So as I said, I'm going to try to unpack the arguments behind the Common Core for and against, and the assumptions that are attached to those arguments. So here's some background first. The Common Core, as most people know, are English language arts and math standards for K-12 public education with aligned assessments. And you're going to hear a lot more about the assessments from Henry and Mike. 45 states and the District of Columbia initially adopted the Common Core fully. I'll return to this. The Common Core were established in 2008 and 2009 under the auspices of the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the nonprofit organization Achieve, another very small nonprofit, Student Achievement Partners, who have the mission of helping educators use evidence to improve student achievement, and now especially to help with implementation of the Common Core. There was a writing group of 27 people. Who was actually part of that writing group is one of the controversies, believe it or not, especially whether there were teachers involved in the writing, and there have been arguments both ways. David Coleman is generally acknowledged as one of the chief architects of the Common Core. He was with Student Achievement Partners and is now the president of College Board. Gene Wilhoit was also central. He is the former executive director of the Council of Chief State School Officers and is now with Student Achievement Partners. Basic characteristics of the Common Core, and all of these are controversial, depending on, even these characteristics are controversial. So that the first one, the Common Core are a voluntary state initiative that has been developed and is now being implemented. The Common Core represent a rigorous, coherent set of 21st century standards that equal or exceed the best standards in the country. The Common Core is not a curriculum. Rather, it recommends knowledge and skills that students ought to have at the end of each grade level. And the Common Core builds on best national and international practice. As I said, all of those things are controversial. Now, I want to take that and move it down here and just add a little bit more in terms of basic information. One thing that's important to know is that a lot of money for the Common Core has been provided by Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. The estimates that I usually hear are exceed $230 million. That funded a lot of organizations of all kind. For example, the Hunt Institute, which is former governors, that institute has been central in providing help with school districts, states, schools in implementing the Common Core. Certainly, this is not a federal initiative, as we say, but it had a lot of support because at the same time the Common Core were being developed, the Obama administration launched the Race to the Top initiative at $4.3 million. And in order I'm not used to these big numbers. In order to be eligible for Race to the Top funds, states had, and for NCLB waivers, states had to have rigorous, world-class, coherent standards that would prepare people for college and career. They were not required to adopt the Common Core, but many people argue that that was understood as what you were supposed to do, and it was certainly one of the easiest ways to be able to claim that you had those kinds of standards. Attached to the Common Core are two assessment consortia, PARC and SBAC, funded at those levels by Race to the Top funds. There was also an expert group who evaluated the standards. They were funded by the Gates Foundation. Now, what I want to do is look at the arguments behind the Common Core. So first I'm going to look at arguments made by the proponents, those who advocate the Common Core. And what I want to suggest is that advocates talked about two problems that the Common Core would address so that both of these problems had the same solution. That is, to develop a single set of world-class standards for all states, all schools, all teachers, and all students. So here's the first problem. And this is the most important one, I think, or the one we hear the most often. The problem was described as the fact that the United States is in deep jeopardy in terms of its ability to be competitive globally and to innovate. In addition, we have very low student achievement compared to other nations who are our competitors. Many students are not prepared for either college or a career, and this was especially emphasized in the STEM areas. Across the states, standards are low and uneven, and states, teachers, and schools are simply not accountable for rigorous standards. There are a series of assumptions behind this construction of the problem. I'm only going to mention the first one I have on this list in the interest of time, and I think this is the most important one. It's asterisked up there. The assumption is that rigorous common standards will increase individual achievement and national productivity and security. The second problem, first I want to talk about some of the groups that supported this. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Business Roundtable, Fordham Foundation, National Security Council, and neoliberal Democrats and Republicans. Now, some of this has shifted, which I'll say more about in a moment. The second problem is that there is dramatic variation in the quality of standards across states. This is coupled with a persistent pattern of low achievement for minority and low-income students. Fewer minority students than others are prepared for college or career and for entering STEM fields. Now, again, a whole set of assumptions. I'll just mention the first one, and that is that high common standards for everybody will remedy this pattern of low achievement. This argument was supported by the NAACP, the La Raza, and other civil rights organizations. I'm putting in green both Obama and Duncan and professional education organizations and teacher unions because they talked often about both of those problems and how the Common Core would address both of those sets of issues. Again, a lot of this has shifted. Now I want to say a little bit about the opposition to the Common Core, and again, look at the arguments behind the opposition and some of the assumptions. Again, there are two kinds of general opposition, both leading to the same action, which is to oppose the Common Core. So the first argument made by the opposition is this: education is a local matter. Sometimes people talk about a family matter, sometimes about a state matter, by long tradition and constitutionally. The Common Core represent a major overreach of the federal government into these local matters. Third, that the Common Core limit teachers' and schools' academic freedom. And finally, that there is no evidence that having a Common Core of standards will increase student achievement. A lot of assumptions. I'll just mention the first. Common Core represents a federal power grab and a threat to state autonomy. Groups that have agreed with this opposition include the Republican National Committee, some Republican governors, Tea Party members, and again, that's shifting and changing, Christian rights groups, homeschool groups, conservative foundations, including the Heritage, Cato, and Pioneer Institutes, and there's a Koch brothers money behind some of this opposition. The second argument in opposition to the Common Core is quite different, and that is this: the Common Core are part of a continued attack on public education that will ultimately harm our democracy. Second, there is way too much focus on tests. The tests are too hard. The way they are set up will mean that there will be a large number of students who will fail. Third, teachers and students have not been adequately prepared. Implementation is too fast, too rocky. The timing issues are really a problem. Fourth, there was a lack of democratic participation in the process. Our opportunities for revision are lacking. Another argument against the Common Core is that the standards are inappropriate. Especially this argument has been made in relation to early childhood education and in terms of English and social studies. And finally, that the costs are prohibitive. First assumption that I want to mention is this: the problem of American schools is not about standards, but the fact that we have two unequal school systems. People who made this argument include parents and parents groups, what I call progressive education critics, Diane Ravitch, Patrick Shannon, etc., and teachers and teacher groups. Now, you can put all this on one screen. The problem is you need either a really, really big piece of paper and tiny print, and things keep shifting. So, for example, this map of the states that have adopted the Common Core was accurate as of the summer of 2014, but since that time, 4 more states have repeals of the Common Core pending, and other states are possibly moving in that direction. Another example of shifts is that Education Next has done a poll, did one in 2013 and one in 2014, of teachers and what their views were on the Common Core. And you can see how dramatically the percentage of teachers polled who support the Common Core has decreased, and those who opposed have increased. So this is by way of saying these things change. I'm just going to make one more comment. I think we'll get into this in the discussion. We labeled our colloquium for today, "Where Are We?" And so I thought one part of where we are is that we have a shifting landscape. The Common Core have become a wedge issue in the Republican Party. There has been hasty production of Common Core aligned, and I put that in quotation marks on purpose, textbooks and materials that many schools have now bought, but there are a lot of questions about whether they're really aligned. All of those things sound like we're moving away from the Common Core, but many states are moving forward and providing professional development for teachers, some of which has been characterized as very good. Some states have adopted their own Common Core-like standards, making very few changes, even though they've repealed the Common Core, and a huge amount of infrastructure, funds, time, many other resources has already been invested into this whole project. And I think that's going to play a huge role in where we are and where we go with this.
Good afternoon, everyone. And let me just say, I really appreciate Marilyn's review. That helps even people like me who've been thinking about the Common Core for a long time to get a nice perspective. It reminds me, actually, that when Moses came down from Mount Sinai the second time with the tablets, he actually put a vote to the Israelites. You know, did they want to accept or not accept? But you'll note that it was an up or down decision. He didn't ask them to vote on each particular commandment, assuming, knowing the people that as he did, that there would be concerns about this or that. And despite the divine provenance of the commandments, that probably they would not all pass. So the Common Core, which does not have divine provenance, is subject to that kind of death by 1,000 slices. I guess my feeling is that it's a reasonable set of standards. I think it does provide, as for the nation as a whole, a different set of markers, if you will, for what an educated young person should know and should be able to do. So I'm a little concerned about all the high level of opposition to the Common Core that's arisen. And as I'll say in a minute, I think it's not just the Common Core as a set of standards, but it's the whole set of what I call the academic core that represents the real thrust of what a national set of standards can do and where the real opposition lies. So what I'm calling the academic core represents a set of integrated activities around curriculum, instruction, and assessment. And what the Common Core state standards represent is sort of the foundation. And the hope of the individuals and the groups that propelled the Common Core forward and are supporting it now is that it would lead to a coherence that is often lacking now in most of our states. So what are the different consortia that are now working on assessments that are related to the Common Core? Well, we know the two most famous one, and of course Marilyn mentioned them both the PARC and the Smarter Balance. These are called the comprehensive consortia because they are the ones that are building assessments for basically grades 3 through 12 for English language arts and mathematics. They are the focus of attention. They're also the focus of most of the investment, and they are the ones on which a great deal of accountability is going to be resting. But there are other assessments as well. The so-called alternative assessments or alternate assessments, and there are two consortia there as well, the Dynamic Learning Maps and the National Center and State Collaborative. DLM is at the University of Kansas, the National Center is at the University of Minnesota. And they will be are developing assessments that will be appropriate for the approximately 1% of students who are unable to take the PARC or Smarter Balance assessments, even with extensive accommodations. And then finally, there are two consortia building English language proficiency assessments with somewhat different goals and different target populations. I won't go into those for now. There just isn't enough time for today. Now, let me just then turn back to the PARC and Smarter Balance consortia. There's really quite a large or quite a long list of deliverables. As Marilyn pointed out, they are the beneficiaries of somewhere right now almost $200 million each. So one would hope you're going to get something for $200 million, even though it is a government. And in fact, I think we will be getting quite a bit. Of course, the summative assessments in ELA and math, as well as assessments in speaking and listening, which will be now not voluntary, but not part of the summative assessments. And then an extensive list of accommodations for English language learners and students with disabilities. And this has been a major effort on the part of both consortia. They're also going to be developing performance standards. And again, we have to distinguish between content standards, which represent what we would like students to know and to be able to do, and performance standards, which actually set thresholds for what a student should be able to do, what kind of evidence they need to provide in order to satisfy the claim that they are ready to move on to the next grade, that they are on track for career and college and career, or even that they are ready for college and career at the end of high school. But the consortia are also providing schools, teachers, with diagnostic and interim assessments that are more timely and more focused on providing instructional guidance for teachers and students. They've also built model content frameworks, which are sort of mini curricula. And again, given the debates that Marilyn referred to, the consortium have been very careful, perhaps not careful enough, to avoid any sign that they are trying to develop a curriculum. But the model content frameworks are pretty much like mini curricula as exemplars, if you will, as illustrations of what a aligned curriculum would look like. They've also built some instructional modules and item banks, again, to help teachers, principals come up to speed in terms of how to teach and how to assess in ways that are aligned with the Common Core. But as extensive as this work is, it doesn't replace what states must do as the local responsible authorities for providing curriculum guidance, providing professional development, and other kinds of assessments to support the transition from their current system to a Common Core aligned system. Finally, the consortia have built an enormous infrastructure because these assessments are going to be generally developed over a computer or tablet or some other technological device. So a lot of technology support has been provided, and as well some online professional learning modules. So really quite a lot to be done in somewhat under 4 years. So what's the current status? And as Marilyn alluded, the current status is changing daily, as I've just learned. But more or less, they've built the assessment frameworks which lead to the kind of blueprints that guide the item writers and test assemblers. And item development has been done. Each of the consortia has developed well over 10,000 items. Both consortia conducted field trials this past spring, collected data on anywhere from 1 million to 2 million students. That data has been analyzed and reanalyzed, and the goal is to use the results from the field trial to determine which items are, quote, working and not working, and for those that are working, to calibrate them psychometrically so that they can either, in the case of PARC, be put into or organized in test forms, or in the case of CAT, in the case of the Smarter Balance, which is using computerized adaptive testing, to be put into a item vat from which the algorithm, the adaptive algorithm, will choose items according to particular requirements. The infrastructure for delivery, administration, scoring, and so on, reporting, is almost in place, but they do have a few more months to get it straight, though we should remember that for certain schools in certain states that are doing block scheduling, some of these assessments are going to be fielded this December. Another complication, and a worrisome one, is that while both assessments are intended to be delivered by computer, they do have to make accommodations or provisions for paper and pencil delivery, either for students who cannot take it on the computer or for entire schools that may not have the necessary infrastructure. So at least for the next couple of years, there's going to be a dual mode administration, which of course adds to cost and complexity. And then finally, each of the consortia, hoping to be more than a one-shot wonder, are planning how to sustain themselves over time, both financially but also technically. One of the key issues that they are grappling with, and which will be, I think, very problematic, at least in the first couple of years, it has to do with standard setting. One of the requirements of the contracts that they signed with the federal government was that they have to develop standards for college and career readiness, and I'm sure you've heard of that term many times now. And the idea is that by a certain level of performance on the assessments, whether the PARC assessment or the Smarter Balanced assessment, students should be certified to be ready to take courses, credit-bearing courses in community colleges or four-year colleges without the need for remediation. And in fact, in some cases, the standards are set so that not only are they able to enter those courses, but to actually succeed at a certain level, B- or something like that. Now, in the earlier grades, this of course applies to the end of high school. In the earlier grades, what is required is some kind of early warning system, if you will, so that the school can determine whether a student is, quote, on track to being college and career ready, or whether they are off track and require extra interventions, extra work, or something like that. Technically, this is very difficult to do because at the moment we don't have, of course, any longitudinal data. So anything we want to say about whether or not a particular level of performance represents college or career readiness has to be done sort of indirectly by trying to link these assessments to other assessments like the National Assessment or the SAT or the ACT and use the kinds of information that they have available through their own longitudinal studies in order to, if you will, determine remotely whether a particular level of achievement is sufficient to signal college and career readiness. It becomes even more complicated when you think about how to walk that back through the grades and tell whether a grade 4 student is, quote, on track to be college and career ready. And obviously a great deal of expert judgment is going to be needed. One of the interesting political questions that states are going to face is how do they balance the issue of college and career readiness, which is, if you will, an appropriate goal for the end of high school, with the practical requirements that they can't have 80% of their high school leaving class not get a high school diploma because they haven't met the college and career readiness standards, at least initially. And so states are going to have to figure out how to have perhaps a dual track. One track for students who are going to get a high school diploma but not be declared college and career ready, and the other track being declared college and career ready, and how they're going to plan that out and how they're going to deal with what in Washington calls the optics of the situation is going to be very interesting to watch. As Marilyn mentioned, one of the concerns that we have and that I'm particularly interested in is what I call design trade-offs. That is, how does an assessment design consortium achieve its goals to the extent possible while still respecting the kinds of constraints of time, cost, and technology. And in this case, both of the consortia have had to moderate their goals to some extent, both in terms of generating evidence for all of the so-called hard-to-assess constructs, how to deal with the fact that they weren't able to build, for example, in mathematics, all the technology tools that would allow students to do the kinds of high-level mathematical development that they would like, and even refining accommodations. Moreover, the tight timeline has meant that there have been some, I would say, some limitations in terms of the kind of quality that they're building into the assessment forms, in terms of dealing with security issues, and so on, and obviously testing the infrastructure. So the time constraint imposed by the government contract, I think, has had a deleterious effect on the assessments, let alone the issues of opportunity to learn and professional development for students and teachers. So quickly, the list of critical issues, I think the robustness of the infrastructure to support millions of tests being taken over a relatively short period of time, the readiness of schools and the security issues. I think it's unavoidable that we're going to have not just regular security issues, but actually active sabotage of the system, and how well they can protect against that is not clear. And I won't go over the sources of opposition. Marilyn's done a good job of that. And perhaps the most critical issue in the long run is what is the economic viability of this consortia, given the reduced number of states that have signed on and the continuing shifting of the landscape. So to come back to the academic core, it seems to me that what we really are hoping for is that the states, together with the consortia, will develop a system over time that will in fact show some coherence, that the vertices of curriculum instruction assessment will be balanced despite the overwhelming influence of high-stakes accountability that drives assessment forward. And then finally, the issue of timing and the way in which, not only in which the states are implementing this new academic core, but the pace at which they will impose high-stakes consequences for teachers of schools on the basis of the new assessments. Thank you very much.
All right, so I'm going to focus on the potential lasting impacts of really the Race to the Top assessment program. And really what I'm trying to do is say, listen, as Marilyn laid out, there's all kinds of issues, all kinds of opposition growing, some due to real concerns, a lot due to politics and misunderstandings. But the bottom line is these challenges are leading some states to move away, not always from the Common Core itself, but at least from the Race to the Top assessment consortia. And I think it would be interesting, from an intellectual perspective, to say, well, what happens if all the states went away from the Race to the Top assessment program? We just spent $400 million developing these tests. Would there be any lasting impact? And from my perspective, I think there would be. I think there's been some significant changes to the way that we think about K-12 assessment, at least at the state level, that I think are a direct result of the work that's occurred today. And these really fall into kind of three broad categories. One is I think we've seen a major change in the way that K-12 assessment programs have embraced and are thinking about technology and the role that it can play. We've seen huge growth particularly at the state policy level around accessibility and thinking about accessibility rather than just accommodations. And we've also seen more in the industry side some significant changes to practices, particularly with respect to how tests are developed and to some extent the administration practices that are employed for state testing programs. So I'm going to take a few minutes and talk specifically about each of these three areas. I'm going to start with technology. If you go back probably 3 or 4 years ago, there's a lot of concern about Park and Smarter Balance in particular being online, and concern that there's no way our schools are going to be able to handle this. Last year, there was over 6 million kids participated in field tests online. And so that was an early indication, and there was very few problems. And those problems that occurred were largely local issues as opposed to kind of the large system failures that people were anticipating. And I think, particularly at the state level and in those schools that participated in the field test, there's been an increased trust in technology being able to actually support online testing. And this spring, it'll be very interesting to see when these programs go to scale. There's probably going to be about 14, possibly 18 million kids tested online. And if that's successful, I think we're going to really see a lasting impact of computer-based testing, and that it's the way that many large-scale programs are going to move in the future. In terms of adaptive testing, Henry referred to the adaptive testing that Smarter Balance is doing. It's not really a new technology, but it's a new technology to K-12 assessment. And it's a technology or approach that's not well understood because we're used to thinking about a test as being this fixed set of questions that all kids answer. In an adaptive test, it's not. We have a large pool of items, and we pick items that seem to be providing the best or most information about each individual student. So in the end, each student's test may look different in terms of the items that they answered. And so for a lot of people, that's problematic if we're then trying to compare individuals on their test scores. And I think there's been, particularly in the Smarter Balance states, a lot of growth in at least at the state and at the district level, their understanding of adaptive testing. We also see in the NCSIC, which is one of the alternate assessment consortia for the 1% of students that won't participate in the Smarter Balances Park, they're moving to a stage adaptive test where rather than adapting individual items, they're adapting sets of items to try to better measure these students. And finally, Park is using adaptive technologies for its diagnostic assessments. So you can see three different uses of adaptive testing that have been embraced by probably, if you counted them all up, it must be close to 40 states. And are being rolled out in different ways at the district level, and people are accepting of these now. So I think, again, if the consortia went away, I think you'd see some states continuing to make use of adaptive tests. And it's interesting, Utah, which dropped out of Smarter Balance, ended up developing and implementing an adaptive test on their own. Technology enhanced items. Most of us, when we took tests, we had multiple choice items, we had maybe open response essay questions. It was really just two types of items. The consortia, because they're on technology, have introduced or are using 10 or 12 different items, depending on how you count, many of which are enabled by technology. So I want to just take a quick minute to show you what some of these look like. Yes. Technology enabled. So this is a really simple item, where these aren't actual questions, but it shows you how the functionality, where you might ask students to sort things, sort order of events in the story, sort historical events, so you're just kind of dragging these things around. Pretty simple, not all that robust, but it's a good mechanism if you require students to put things in order. Fractions, so here you're adding fractions, and you can demonstrate your understanding by creating these fraction models, much like kids might do on paper or with manipulatives. Here's another one where you're asked to identify or highlight or collect sources of evidence directly from text. So I already have it highlighted so we can see what we're dragging, but I can basically build an argument by pulling out pieces of text. Or there's other items where you go in and actually highlight the text rather than selecting from a multiple choice item. These are simple slider items where you're asking students to show whatever, maybe number lines, it may be thermometers, whatever. Other items where you're asked to plot points, so you're actually creating graphical representations, or other items where it's more complex and you're actually creating lines, creating quadratic expressions, representations, and so forth. So there's a variety of different item types is the larger point that are now being used, particularly by Park and Smarter Balance. And while it's unclear how well these different item types are going to work for measuring certain constructs and how well some students will be able to use these, for the first time they won't experience it for the first time on the test, but how well students will be able to interact with these. I think there's a clear interest and embrace of thinking about what can we do differently in a technology space rather than on paper. And then finally actually there's one more. There's also kind of a new thinking about administration and accessibility, and really thinking about how do we match the environment, the testing experience that a student has in terms of the accessibility and accommodation supports based on their individual needs. And I'll say more about this in a moment. But all the consortia have developed computer-based systems that think about who is the person as an individual, what are their accessibility needs, and how do we tailor that testing experience, hopefully to meet their individual needs. That's been widely accepted now across all states and all programs, and I think that's a significant step forward. And finally, this is more technical, but I think it will be important. There's been an embrace of these interoperability standards and of open source solutions. This is important because even though it's all around code, it's going to allow programs over time to be able to use their items across systems. So you can imagine something that's used initially for high-stakes testing, moving into an interim program, moving into a local curriculum. That content, because they're using interoperability standards, can flow from one place to the other without having to effectively reprogram that item, which is very expensive for state testing programs. And we're also seeing adoption of open source solutions. These are technologies that are available to the public to go and use or to enhance, and you contribute the code back to that open source community. And so NCSIC and PARC in particular are making use of the open source technologies. And for state testing programs, that's going to be really important because it'll lower the cost of the technology over time, and it'll allow districts and other types of programs to make use of the same assessment platforms, basically at a minimal cost. So hopefully we'll start seeing better alignment between the experiences kids have in the classroom with the experiences they're having on these larger scale testing programs. In terms of accessibility, there's been a much stronger emphasis on thinking about students who are English language learners and designing items so that they're accessible for that population. We're seeing, as I said, a move away, I shouldn't say away from, but an expansion from accommodations to thinking about accessibility, and in particular, thinking about accessibility for all students. It used to be accommodations were limited to students who had IEPs. Now, all these testing programs are thinking about, yes, we need to make sure we're meeting the needs of students who have IEPs, but other students have needs too, and we need to make sure that we're creating an accessible environment for all students so we can maximize the measure of all students. And these are just diagrams from Smarter Balance and PARC that kind of show their accessibility policies that they've put in place. And you can see these universal tools, or what PARC calls features for all students. They're, magnification, which we could use here, color contrast, and other types of things that really don't interfere or have anything to do with the construct that we're measuring. They're available to all kids now. You don't need an IEP. Anybody can magnify. Anyone can color contrast. For a math test, anybody can have things read to them. So that's a significant change in policy and practice. Then in terms of actual practices, I think the states have really come to value these collaborations. Smarter Balance originally, I think, were 24 states, Henry? Something like that. And PARC started off with about 19 states. NCSIC, I think, has 22 states. DLM has 26 states, or I don't know, may have gone over 50 there. But the states have really become accustomed to working together, and they understand the value of working together. Prior to the Race to the Top assessment program, there was really only one example of this. That was the NECAP states. Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Rhode Island were the only ones that had ever worked together on a common assessment program. So even if these Race to the Top programs went away, I would be surprised if you didn't see a set of smaller kind of collaboratives occurring across states to support their programs going forward. As Henry alluded to, there's been a return of extended tasks. Back in the 90s, there was a lot of emphasis on performance assessments. Both the major consortium have forms of performance assessments that they're using again. People see the value of them. We'll see how successful they are in implementing them. Personal needs preferences, that builds on the accessibility. I won't go into detail on that. And finally, from an item authoring perspective, there's been a lot of emphasis on universal design, and that is very much part of item authoring now within the industry. And I don't think we're going to move away from that. So last comments are, I think as we move forward, we are going to have to be thoughtful about how we use these technology-enhanced items. There's, people are experimenting with them, people like them, but we're going to have to be much more critical as we decide when to use it and when not to use it. These open source technologies and the standards, there is going to be challenges going forward in terms of how you manage open source technologies and how you control the costs of implementing those. We're going to have to figure out how to be more efficient in developing technology-enhanced items and items that address accessibility issues. And finally, comparability. As Henry alluded to, we're going to have these different devices being used and going to have to think about critically, how do we know that the scores on an iPad are comparable to when scores on a computer are comparable to scores on paper? So I think that's a significant challenge that remains. So I'll stop there. So do you want to manage questions, or how are we going to do this? No, I'm not a good manager.
Well, I would like to thank all of you for extremely informative presentations, and we're very fortunate we have some time remaining for questions. So we'll open it to the audience. Yes. And if you have a specific person it's directed to, or you can decide among yourselves who the question best fits.
I think it might be open to everyone, but one thing I was thinking about is if we are attracting students back to middle school for college and career readiness status, is that getting into labeling them and changing teachers' perceptions, and is there any talk about those kind of issues?
That's a good question. I think that that is a concern, and a lot will depend on, first of all, how those determinations are made, how they're, and even perhaps more so, how they're communicated. One could argue that getting good information about where, in terms of moving to a student profile rather than a single score is something that is much more instructionally useful. And I think if we can get away from some of those labels as college career ready, particularly at the early grades where technically you really can't say very much, I think that overall it would be very positive. I would hope that it would be a very positive step. As we move closer to high school, middle school into high school, there again, you really need an early warning system, because too often students are misled, and even their teachers are misled thinking that they're really ready. And then when it comes to the final examinations, or even worse, they get the high school diploma, and then, as we've heard, come to a community college and find out that they're really not ready. And they end up spending time and money trying to make up for what they could have had in high school. So I think there are some dangers, but overall I think it's going to be, particularly if the kind of advice that the consortia assessments can provide is instructionally useful, I think it's going to be overall a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, I know that the consortia are thinking very hard about how to report results to try to avoid some of those issues. I'm not sure they necessarily have the answers right now, but I know that they're conscious of that. And it just is one example. One of the things they're grappling with is, they will end up having these performance levels or categorizations. And I know that, at least in part, one of the things they would like to do is, even if you're in a low performance level, to be able to report and display and have the front picture not just be on what performance level you are, but how you've changed or how you've grown, even if it's remaining within that same performance level from year to year, to try to communicate that, even if you're performing at a lower level, you are still making progress, and there's still an opportunity for you to advance. That doesn't really address the larger issue necessarily, but they are being thoughtful about it.
I think it's a really good question too, and I'm not quite as confident as my numbers friends are about this. And I think in particular, the area of early childhood, where so many early childhood educators have argued that a lot of the standards aren't appropriate in the first place. and they're not developmentally appropriate, and there's a huge range in terms of how, especially young children and others develop. So I think it's going to be a really, really tricky area, and frankly, I think it's inevitable that there are going to be labels attached to kids who aren't college and career ready because they can't count to 100. I think that's supposed to be one of the kindergarten standards. So I think it's a huge issue, and I'm worried about it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the dangers is kind of return of tracking and having it occur really early, which, could be problematic. The other thing to be aware of is the assessments themselves are going to be very difficult, and a lot of kids are going to be in those low levels, at least in the early years. And it'll be interesting to see how the public responds to that.
My question about that idea of a student longitudinally. If a student with these common, if everyone's working together on this, does this mean that if I have a migrant student that moves within a region or across states, that data will follow them and teachers will be able to pick up where that data left off? Or is it locked up even though we're all doing a part in a district's systems?
I don't think that's been quite decided. I think that there will be a, quote, centralized depository, data depository at PART, so that in principle, a student's results could migrate with that student from one park state to another. Exactly how that will play out in practice with individual states being very jealous of that information, concerns about privacy and so on. So my guess is it's going to take a couple of years to work that out. But perhaps even more importantly, the curriculum that student will face, this Common Core standards that drive the curriculum. While the curriculum may be a little bit different from state to state or even district to district, they're not going to have the same kinds of gaps that you have now. You move from one state to another, and you may have a completely different sequencing. So I think from the point of view of the classroom experience, there'll be much less chaos than is the case now. Whether we can find ways to move data across state lines without incurring the lack of whatever remains to be seen. I don't know if you have
I was just going to say, I don't think we can do it and avoid incurring the wrath. And that's another of the controversies that I didn't talk about because there really wasn't time. But some of the parents groups and some teacher groups that are protesting Common Core now make the argument that students are more than data points. And you see that as a slogan on protest signs. And so they're concerned, not that to be sure the information will travel to students. They want students not to just be providing information to, the way it's usually said, is to the federal government, which is not entirely true, but that's one of the ways this is phrased. So I think there will be more and more controversy about that item, or that point itself.
Yeah, I mean, within states, it's a different conversation when you're talking about within states. If you look at, it also differs across the consortia. So Smarter Balance has a different model of implementation, so that in the Smarter Balance states, they're contracting with different vendors, and those vendors will each hold the state's data. So the exchange of data across states will be much more complicated because you're working across systems. PARC, it would be much more feasible if you didn't have the politics and other types of privacy concerns.
There's nothing to prevent a student and a family from taking their data with them and providing it to the school. So it may not be done centrally, but based on an individual family's choice.
Dennis?
So two things. First of all, I'm the mysterious person who's speaking next Tuesday for the C-Steep lecture. And what I'm going to be looking at there is why do the achievement results for Germany on PISA go up consistently since 2000 while they go down or go nowhere in the US, England, and in Sweden? And there's an argument about markets and accountability systems that has something to do with that is related to this. And So if you're interested in coming, it's the first time I'm presenting some of this research I've been doing for a while now. I'd love your feedback. So Andy and I are working with a network of remote rural schools in the Pacific Northwest, and we have not met one educator yet who is not really enthusiastic about the Common Core state standards, because these are folks who felt like they've been left out from a lot of conversations, have not gotten support from their states. They're working on Native American reservations, they're working with immigrant kids, and now finally they can participate in a larger conversation. And they're doing really interesting interdisciplinary curriculum development that's based on their localities. And so they're not experiencing this as federal imposition. And I can't help, when I hear a lot of the opposition to the Common Core, I can't help thinking back to Richard Hofstadter's classic, The Paranoid Style of American Politics. The paranoid style. So I'm wondering, Marilyn, this is really, I think, a question for you, because you were kind of looking at, the profile here and understanding that there's legitimate concern. So, if the Common Core state standards are bad for early childhood, well, then we could fix the standards. That's not necessarily an argument. Let's go back to what Louisiana and Mississippi had beforehand, I hope. So I'm hoping you can help us to understand that dynamic of American culture.
I think that the things that I have read, there are lots of stories and polls, I think, that suggest that a lot of teachers do like working with the Common Core. They find that they are rigorous, interesting standards. So there are lots of teachers, I think, who like the standards. And I wasn't suggesting all teachers are opposed. I was trying to show the shift. But a lot of the teacher groups, and there's one, if you haven't seen the Badass Teachers organization, badassteachers.org, is a collective of teachers who are opposed. I think it's a rather unfortunate label, which they chose, but they're using the acronym BAT. That might be even worse, I don't know. But I think a lot of the opposition from teachers is more connected to the way this is all being implemented, the rush, the materials that are coming into the schools with gold labels on them that say Common Core aligned, but they're really maybe not, and they really don't look so different from what was there before. I think the timing, I think the emphasis on tests, that's more what I hear or what I read in the comments about what teachers think about. So it's more the implementation, the timing, and the testing than the standards themselves and how they get interpreted by groups of teachers in relation to the communities they're serving. So I agree with your point, but that's what I see as more of the opposition.
And I think there's another factor we haven't talked about that's also fueling some of the teacher opposition, and that is the teacher evaluation models that are coming in, right? So what's interesting is you hear a lot of criticism of the tested programs. That they're saying there's too much testing, there's going to be more testing. Well, in fact, if you look at the actual number of tests, there's no more testing in any state that I'm aware of that is going to occur because of the race to the top assessment. The test may be a little bit longer, but that's because they're trying to measure things that weren't measured before that people used to complain about not being measured. So the actual number of tests, I don't believe anywhere is going up. What is changing, and this is in part because of the race to the top, not assessment program, but the other programs, is the requirement that came to implement teacher evaluation models, most of which are making use of test scores as part of the evaluation of teachers. And I think that interacts, it's separate, but it interacts with this concern about the testing that's associated with Common Core and race to the top.
Yeah, from what I read, I think it's the juxtaposition of the timing, that is the rapid time frame in which all of this is going to be implemented, particularly around opportunity to learn, both for the students but also for the teachers, and the imposition of high-stakes consequences, in part driven by student scores, either directly or through these value-added models or student methodology. So I think my sense is that's driving a lot of the opposition on part of teachers.
Could I just, I want to ask one of you two a question. One of the controversies has to do with the claim that the way the tests are being constructed will guarantee big numbers of failures. Can you, one of you speak to that?
I'm not sure what that means.
What
does failure mean?
Well, large numbers of students who aren't doing well. You remember in New York, Duncan's very unfortunate comment about the suburban mothers. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I think we should expect that once they set the standards, the performance standards, at what we might call realistic, that large numbers of students will fall at the lower level. It's not mean, of course, it doesn't mean the students are not as smart as the ones last year. It's just the standards have changed. Now, the reason I think this is something we have to kind of grit our teeth and get through is that, as we've already said, too many students leave with a high school diploma that aren't actually prepared for it. And if we're going to have realistic, the term I like to use is that until the NAEP state standards came around, every state had a hermetically closed system. They could say anything at all. Mississippi could say we're the best. Tennessee could say we're 90% proficient. They could make numbers up. They did make numbers up. And there was, that was the only way in which they were being creative. Once the state standards came into being, and then we saw, well, Tennessee had 90% proficient on its test, but 20% on NAEP. Massachusetts had 40% on its test and 40% on NAEP. What's going on here? And I think what we're moving towards, and I think it's a good goal, is to be honest with students about where they are in relationship to real world requirements. And those real world requirements are increasing, not coming down, as globalization and so on include. So I think there is going to be a rough transition, and a lot will depend on the way in which schools, districts manage the public relations. And unfortunately, because of the political discourse, it's going to be very, very different. But I think it's a necessary emetic.
But it's not that it's by design. It's not like the test was designed to have a lot of failures. It's that you're testing things, skills that kids hadn't been tested on before, and at the same time you're raising your expectations. So of course you're going to have more students that are going to fall below those expectations. But that's not really designed in the test. That's because of all the changes that are occurring. And in fact, you could, I always tell the story in the classroom assessment course, that you can have a very difficult test. My calculus test when I was in college, I got a 37. But
What?
Out of 100. 37 out of 100. But I had the second highest score. Someone else had an 87, so I got an A, right? So you can have your score doesn't necessarily correspond with your performance level, because those two things are what you measure and where you draw the line are two separate processes.
As a math educator, there's a lot of things that I like about the Common Core state standards, and as a speech and data educator, I love the increase in sense making and reasoning and argumentation. As much as I love those disciplines, I wonder, with all the funding that's going into this and the way in which we're going about testing accessibility, although great and wonderful, I'm wondering, what does this do in terms of narrowing the problematics of American education as a whole, and particularly looking at systemically under-resourced schools, what that means in terms of the focus on math and ELA at the expense, and we're at a university where there's a lot of people achieving excellence in a lot of different arts and sciences. What does that mean in terms of human possibility, particularly in underrepresented populations?
One of the arguments against the Common Core is that it will do exactly that it will narrow the curriculum, that it will limit what teachers can do. I don't think it has to do that, but I think in certain schools and school districts, it will do that. I mean, we certainly know that from experience with that's a good example. So, I think that will happen. I think it's inevitable.
Yeah, it will. The flip side, again, another personal anecdote, my wife teaches English at Newton, right? And before MCAS, there was kids that she had that got by, they got out of high school and they went and they worked. When MCAS was introduced, because the school was concerned about some kids failing, they created a double block of English, which she taught. And none of the kids failed the MCAS, and now 2 or 3 of them go on to colleges. So we kind of raised, so yeah, those kids have gotten more focused on English, and they probably don't have the electives that they did before. Now, whether those are science and history that they're taking or it doesn't really matter. Their curriculum is effectively been narrowed, but for some of them, opportunities also created. Now, I'm not saying that's the solution, but I do think it's important to think about both the positives and the negatives when you're having this discussion.
I wanted to pick up some more on the conversation about the performance levels and labels being associated with students. Of course, labels like below basic, advanced, proficient are pretty much completely unuseful when it comes to feedback for learning. And so, and it was good to hear that you feel like there's been some careful thought at these consortia about providing better feedback. One of the things that makes feedback better is to, I think Henry, you were mentioning, move to a profile system where you're identifying strengths and weaknesses of students so that feedback can be targeted to those specific areas. To what extent are the consortia adopting subscales? Are students just going to get 2 scores, English score and math score, or will there be more diagnostic?
That's a good question. It's a subject of considerable debate, at least at PARC. I'm not privy to what's going on at Smarter Balance. I think there will be some sub-scores, but of course, as you can appreciate, psychometricians tend to be anti-sub-scores because they say it's all really the same thing except for error. I'm less doctrinaire on that point, but I think there's a more fundamental problem, and that is what we're talking about when we talk about PARC and Smarter Balance are summative assessments, and as you can tell, these come at the end of the year. So there's a limited amount that teachers and students can do once the summative assessment is over. Now, given the developmental structure or framework of the Common Core and presumably of the assessments aligned to that framework, that kind of information can and should be useful as the student moves to the next grade and the next teacher picks that up. I think it's going to be, obviously because of timing issues, of limited utility that year. But that's where the diagnostic and interim assessments come in, because again, the consortia are providing those kinds of opportunities, those kinds of instruments. I would hope that the states over time will augment those assessments, and that's where the profile scores can be really much more useful. And again, with the adaptive diagnostic assessments, we can get pretty rich information pretty quickly and put it to use immediately. So I think it's wrong-headed, really, to sort of say, well, those summative assessments are coming in too late. They're coming in too late because they're summative. It's what's coming before that that's really where the instructional value comes in. And over time, the summative assessment profiles, particularly at the aggregate level, can provide useful information to the principal and to local education authorities about where their system is strong or weak. And that can lead to larger scale improvements rather than just the diagnostic information for the individual, as important as that is.
What's the plan for when students, you've said that there's a lot of students who are not going to do well in these tests. What's the plan, what does the Common Core suggest for kids who are not meeting the Common Core? And I don't know, as a special educator, I'm curious about what the implications are for the special education program. I know you mentioned that there are consortia who are working on individual tests for that, but I'm interested in what the implications of this are for when people don't meet it, which it sounds like a lot of the time students are not going to.
Well, I don't think the Common Core says anything. I mean, the Common Core is a set of standards.
Right.
I think you really have to think about what is the system that's being built on the foundation of the Common Core. What is that system, how does that system going to respond to the needs of individual students? That's going to, I think, depend, as it does now, it depends on state policy, district policy, and the professional judgments of educators, in that school, in that classroom. And I don't think that's going to change. The question is whether, with the Common Core aligned assessments, whether the comprehensive assessments or the alternate assessments, whether the educators will find the information that's gleaned from those assessments to be useful, and whether they'll have the training, the support to make the best instructional use of those assessments. That's going to depend on the kind of professional development they get, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think the Common Core by itself says what's going to happen. It's really just setting the foundation for a much broader system. And again, this is where this idea that this is all kind of federal intrusion. The feds have nothing to say about this. It's all up to the states. And frankly, I've seen many states falling down on the job as they have in the past. They're not moving very quickly. They're embroiled in local politics and things like that. And I think it's unfortunate that both the students in those schools in those states, in many of those schools, and the teachers who are wanting to teach better but are not getting the support, that's where a lot of that problem is coming in. We lay that at the foot of the door of the states, not the federal government. Or Bill Gates, for that.
It's a very interesting topic. And if you were to turn it regionally, it's very interesting to think, for instance, Connecticut is smarter balanced and Massachusetts is PARC, and what that means regionally. And I was wondering if any of you have looked at the map of Common Core in terms of which states are not going Common Core and their child populations. So Texas is not Common Core and has one of the fastest growing populations of children and minority children. Same for Virginia. What does that mean in terms of those, in terms of publications? Publishers are going to try to gear their materials towards the biggest populations of purchasers. And in terms of education policy generally, when the largest states are not Common Core.
That's a tough question. Are we out of time?
Not so easy, getting close.
Getting close. I think that, again, from my point of view, it's unfortunate that that so many states, including some of the larger states like Texas, and as you say, states that have large numbers of vulnerable children, are choosing to go on their own. Now, one can argue that actually Texas has done some interesting things around it, despite cutting back on a lot of the financial support. But they have, for example, a K-16 system. They really worked hard to build bridges between K-12 and higher education. So they've done some things well. They've underfunded schools terribly. I think there's ongoing litigation on that school. So I think America, or the United States of America, is again fracturing, as it so often does. And I think that the states that stay with the program will see some strong benefits. And other states that are, for example, as Mike pointed out, some states have kept with the Common Core but have gone to other assessment providers. And it's hard to see how those assessment providers can build, or have built, assessments that will have the same quality as the two consortia that have spent $400 million in 40 years trying to do it right. So I think we're going to see, again, large heterogeneity across the states, which will be reflected in the National Assessment of Education progress, and to the extent that individual states take part in some of the international assessments, we'll see again a fair amount of heterogeneity. And it may be that over time, public opinion will shift and will push states towards a more coherent strategy. That would be
So what did you say, Mike, you said the rough numbers of which states were in PARC and Smarter Balance, but a lot of states have pulled out.
Yes.
So do you have, what are the current
I think
numbers?
PARC is about 11 states now.
Yeah, it's 11. Well, see, PARC's it's weird. It really depends on how you count. So what's happening?
Massachusetts is weird.
What I was going to respond to was, when answering your question that you asked, it's really important to differentiate those states that have moved away from the Common Core versus those that have moved away from an assessment consortium. Because there's a number of states that have moved out of the consortium, the assessment consortium, but are still Common Core. A case in point, Tennessee. Right? So Tennessee is not part of the PARC anymore. They still are implementing the Common Core. And why I say there's so many states are weird, they actually want a PARC test. They just don't want to be part of PARC. Arizona is very much in the same, yeah, for political reasons. Arizona is very much in the same boat. Louisiana, for another reason, is in the same boat. All three of those states would like to administer park, they just don't want to be part of the consortium for political reasons. So when you ask about the numbers, if you're talking about the numbers that come to the meetings, for park it's about 11 or 12 or 13. For Smarter Balance, I think they're at 18 or 19, yeah.
So, yeah, and I think that's a good point, and I think that one can hope, I don't think, one can hope that after the election, things will settle down more and the political maneuverings will be somewhat reduced. And of course, after this election, we'll be ready for the presidential election.
So 10 states that are not part of the consortium use their assessments?
Well, so there's an interesting, so I'll use a Smarter Balance. It's either Nebraska or, I think it's Nebraska. It's one of those central states. It was part of Smarter Balance, dropped out of Smarter Balance. Smarter Balance has a model where you can license their content for like $8 a kid or whatever it is. So they want to license the content and then rearrange it to create a fixed form test. That's Smarter Balance, right? So there's all kinds of interesting stuff because they want Smarter Balance. To answer your question, there are mechanisms for states to make use of this content, and one of the requirements of the grants is that it goes into the public domain with certain security requirements. Park is supposed to be releasing their licensing program this week, if it's not already out. So they'll have a similar model. But the question is, if someone else is administering a test, is it the same test?
We have one last question in the back.
In terms of performance, I mean, it sounds like a lot of these states, they want to test without the performance standards that come with them. That kind of brings up the question of, even if you're part of the consortium, is there anyone doing work where we're aligning Smarter Balances scores and performance standards with parks scores and performance standards? Because we could end up with a nation, even if everyone went 50-50, or half the kids having some label attached to them that who knows what equates to the other half of the kids.
Yeah, there's an intent to do that. It's too early to be able to do that because the performance levels at Park, Smarter Balance is just setting theirs. Park won't set theirs until next summer. So it's too early to be able to do that. There's no operational data. So I think there's an intent to do that. The larger question is if you're really comparing apples to apples, even though they're intended to be measuring the same set of standards. There's another project that is underway right now looking at the quality of the assessments, because one of the things we didn't talk about is there's a third test that's out there that was developed by ACT that's being marketed to some of these states. It's designed to measure the Common Core as well. So there's a project happening right now that's funded by Gates and 4 other foundations to look at the quality of these different assessments of the Common Core. It's not exactly a comparability study, but it's looking at the comparability and the quality of these tests.
Well, our time is ending, so I'd like to thank Marilyn and Henry and Mike for being with us today, and I think it's an excellent demonstration of the rich conversation and dialogue that emerges when we bring folks together from across the school. We have such great expertise here, and so we take too few times, I think, to gather together and to have dialogues across faculty and across departments. And I'd like to thank all of other members of the faculty who are here and students who are here for participating in this, and hopefully through the streaming it will also be available for other audiences to view after this event. So.
And I just want to remind people that our next colloquium is December 9th. Is that right? December 9th. And it's on teacher evaluation, which is probably as controversial as the Common Core, or maybe even more controversial. Moira Raftery has flyers for that, which have just become available, so if you'd like one, she can pass them out to you. Now, I think that one is also going to be really provocative.
Excellent. Thanks again to all. Thank you.